You are over 60, and somewhere in the past year or two, something has shifted. Small enough to explain away, persistent enough that you have noticed. Maybe it is the name of someone you have known for years that simply is not there when you reach for it. Maybe it is walking into a room with a clear purpose and arriving with none. Maybe it is the moment you realized you had already told this story, and you can see it in someone's face before they say a word. And the last time you brought it up with your doctor, what you heard was, "At your age, this is to be expected." My name is James Whitmore. For the past 11 years, I have spent most of my professional life inside peer-reviewed clinical research, reading the trials, studying the mechanisms, and translating what the science actually says into language that is useful outside a medical journal. And I want to talk to you today about something that does not come up in most medical appointments. Not because the science is uncertain, not because your doctor is indifferent, but because the habits that can genuinely protect your brain over the next 20 years, the 6 I am going to walk you through in the next 25 minutes, none of them arrive via a prescription pad. There is no pharmaceutical company funding a patient awareness campaign for leafy greens. There is no insurance billing code for a conversation about what your brain does, biologically, during the 90 minutes of deep sleep you may or may not be getting each night. And the average primary care appointment in the United States lasts 15 minutes. So here is what the science has found. Across 27 published studies, including a randomized controlled trial published 4 months ago in one of the most respected peer-reviewed journals in the world, about what your brain needs from you every day, and why the conversation almost never takes place. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. Leave your answer in the comments below. Tell me your age, and whether a doctor has ever sat with you specifically to talk about preventing Alzheimer's, not screening for it, not managing risk factors for unrelated reasons, but having the prevention conversation by name. I read every comment on this channel. I want to know how many of you are hearing this for the first time today. Now, 6 habits. I'm going to walk through them from number 6 to number 1. And number 1 is the reason I made this video. It involves something that almost everyone watching this right now believes they have handled. A study published in January 2026 looked directly at what is happening in your brain during the hours you are asleep, and what it confirmed, for the first time in humans, should stop you cold. I will get there in about 20 minutes. Do not go anywhere. Let me give you 30 seconds of history, because it changes everything about how you hear what comes next. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, the medical consensus on Alzheimer's was essentially this: it is a disease of genetics and aging. If you were unlucky enough to have the genes, or simply unlucky enough to live long enough, it would find you. Nothing you did in your daily life would meaningfully change that. Doctors were not withholding anything. That was genuinely what the science said. Then, in 2015, 2 things happened in the same year that began to break that consensus apart. A large randomized controlled trial conducted in Finland, the FINGER trial, published in The Lancet, showed for the first time that a structured, multi-habit lifestyle intervention could significantly improve cognitive performance in adults at elevated risk for decline. In that same year, a research team at Rush University Medical Center published a study showing that adults who followed a specific dietary pattern they called the MIND diet had a 53% lower rate of developing Alzheimer's over 4.5 years, compared to those eating the least healthfully. I am going to give you the complete picture of what that 53% actually means, and what it does not mean when we get to habit 3. The field kept moving. In 2017, the Lancet Commission concluded that 35% of dementia cases were attributable to modifiable risk factors. In 2020, they updated that to 40%. In 2024, they updated it again. 14 modifiable risk factors now identified, and the estimate raised to approximately 45% of all dementia cases worldwide being potentially preventable. That is roughly 25 million people per year. Here is the finding from that same 2024 Lancet Commission that does not get nearly enough attention. Age-specific Alzheimer's incidence, meaning the rate at which people of a given age actually develop the disease, is already declining in high-income countries. Not because we have a better drug, because populations that improved their cardiovascular health, their education levels, and certain lifestyle habits over the past 3 decades are now aging differently. The disease is not inevitable. What people do changes who gets it, even at a population scale. We went from nothing you can do to nearly half of all cases are potentially preventable in 30 years. That shift has not yet reached most exam rooms. Think of your brain as a house you will live in for the rest of your life. The scientific field spent decades searching for a contractor who could renovate it, a drug, a genetic therapy, a biological override. What the research found instead is that the house never needed a contractor. It needed an owner who showed up, consistently, with the right maintenance habits. One note before we begin. If you have a confirmed early onset diagnosis, a genetic mutation your neurologist has identified, or you are currently caring for someone with a dementia diagnosis, these habits work alongside medical care, not in its place. Please keep those conversations going with your physician. But if you are in your 50s or 60s, you are watching this because you want to know what the science actually says. You are in exactly the right place. 6 habits. Let's begin. Habit 6 is the one your doctor is most likely already monitoring, and almost certainly never explained to you in these terms. Most people over 60 know their blood pressure number. Many are on medication for it. A smaller number have been told what their LDL cholesterol and fasting blood sugar are. What almost none of them have been told is the precise mechanism by which these 3 numbers connect to Alzheimer's disease. Here is that mechanism. Amyloid beta, the protein that forms the plaques that are the defining physical hallmark of Alzheimer's, does not simply accumulate in the brain and stay there. The brain has a clearance system. One of its primary exit routes runs through the walls of the brain's blood vessels. When those vessel walls are chronically damaged by high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, or excess LDL cholesterol, those exits progressively close. Amyloid accumulates. The infrastructure for clearance deteriorates faster than the protein that needs clearing. The SPRINT-MIND trial, a randomized controlled trial of over 9,300 adults with hypertension, published in JAMA in 2019, tested what happened when you aggressively lowered blood pressure, targeting a systolic reading below 120 instead of the traditional threshold of below 140. The result? A 19% lower rate of mild cognitive impairment and a 17% lower rate of probable dementia. Not heart attacks, not strokes, dementia, from blood pressure control alone. In 2024, the Lancet Commission added high LDL cholesterol to its list of modifiable Alzheimer's risk factors for the first time. The mechanism. Excess cholesterol in the brain is directly linked to increased amyloid deposition. The Commission also identified diabetes as one of the strongest individual risk factors on the list. Insulin resistance impairs amyloid clearance and drives the phosphorylation of tau, the protein that forms the tangles that are Alzheimer's second pathological signature. The combination of vascular damage and amyloid pathology is additive. A modest amount of each, amounts that would cause minimal harm individually, can together produce significant cognitive impairment. This is why the Whitehall 2 cohort study, following nearly 6,000 adults over 25 years, found that ideal cardiovascular health at age 50 was associated with substantially lower dementia incidence by the time those people reached their 70s and 80s. I want to tell you about Dorothy. She is 66 years old, a retired school librarian from Virginia. For 11 years, her blood pressure had been managed, her doctor's word, not hers. Her systolic reading ran consistently around 138, sometimes 140. Medicated, technically controlled, never specifically connected to her brain in a single conversation. She had no symptoms that frightened her. What she had was a quiet awareness that she was slower to pull words from a conversation than she used to be. She read about the sprint mind findings and brought them to her cardiologist. They worked together to intensify her treatment plan: a medication adjustment, a sodium reduction, and consistent aerobic movement 3 days a week. Her systolic dropped to 117. At her most recent follow-up, her neurologist reviewed her brain MRI and told her something she had not expected to hear. For a woman her age, her white matter was remarkably clean. Minimal lesion burden. The vascular pathway that Alzheimer's uses was intact. What you can do: know your 3 numbers: systolic blood pressure, fasting blood sugar, and LDL cholesterol. The targets that your brain needs are not always identical to the targets your physician may have historically used. For blood pressure, the evidence now points toward a systolic below 130, ideally below 120. For LDL, below 100 milligrams per deciliter. For fasting blood sugar, below 100 milligrams per deciliter. If you do not know what your current numbers are, that conversation with your doctor is not optional. It is the foundation on which every other habit in this video operates. Before we get to habit 5, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually stop and answer it rather than read past it. When was the last time you did something with your brain that made you feel genuinely uncomfortable? Not difficult in a familiar way. Not the challenge of a crossword puzzle you have been doing for 8 years. Uncomfortable in the way that comes from being genuinely out of your depth. Fumbling, uncertain, not knowing what you are doing yet. Think about it, because the specific feeling I just described, the frustration, the disorientation, the sense of incompetence in a new domain, is the neurological sensation of your brain building new connections in real time. And if you cannot remember the last time you felt it, that is the most important thing habit 5 has to tell you. The concept behind this habit is called cognitive reserve, the brain's structural buffer against disease. Sustained cognitive engagement across a lifetime, particularly engagement involving genuine novelty and challenge, builds synaptic density, a larger, more redundant network of functional neural connections. When Alzheimer's pathology destroys some portion of those connections, people with high cognitive reserve can reroute around the damage using the alternatives they have built. This is why 2 people can reach the same post-mortem level of amyloid plaques and tau tangles, and only one of them ever showed clinical dementia during life. The other one had more network to lose before the symptoms surfaced. The research distinction that matters here is between familiarity and novelty. A cohort study published in the BMJ in 2021, following approximately 100,000 workers across their careers, found that workplace cognitive stimulation, specifically the kind involving new challenges, complex problem solving, and unfamiliar demands, was associated with lower levels of the plasma proteins linked to Alzheimer's risk and with meaningfully lower dementia incidence. The operative variable was not being mentally active. It was the presence of ongoing, genuine challenge that had not yet been mastered. Crossword puzzles, after the first few months of learning them, train crossword solving. They do not build reserve. A person who has completed crosswords for 15 years is demonstrating a skill they have already developed, and the brain, which is built to become efficient at what it practices, is no longer doing the hard work that reserve requires. The activities that build reserve in late life are the same ones that built it earlier. Learning an instrument with no prior background, taking a class in a subject that feels foreign, having sustained intellectual conversations with people whose thinking is different from yours, engaging in work, paid, volunteer, or creative, that makes real cognitive demands. The Finger randomized controlled trial, which included formal cognitive training as one of its components, showed that the combination of genuine mental challenge with the other lifestyle habits produced a 25% greater improvement in cognitive performance than controls, not just on paper tests, but on the composite of function that matters in daily life. One more thing. Cognitive reserve is not binary, and it is not fixed. it continues to accumulate in late life. The brain you are working with at 65 is still capable of adding to the buffer it has. The question is only whether you are giving it the conditions it needs to do so. Habit 4 involves something that a significant portion of adults over 60 are quietly doing, and that the research on what it does to the physical structure of the brain is among the most alarming findings in this entire field. Social isolation is classified by the 2024 Lancet Commission as one of the 14 modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's. The data on the size of the effect is, depending on the study, striking. A 2022 analysis published in Neurology using UK Biobank data found that socially isolated individuals had a 26% higher risk of developing dementia, and critically, measurably lower grey matter volume in the hippocampus and frontal regions of the brain compared to their socially connected peers. The hippocampus is the region that Alzheimer's targets first. The structural difference was visible on imaging. A separate UK Biobank cohort, following over 155,000 adults for an average of nearly 9 years, found a 62% higher dementia risk among the socially isolated. An NIA-reported meta-analysis published in 2024, aggregating data from 600,000 participants across 21 longitudinal cohorts, found that loneliness, which is not the same as isolation but often travels with it, was associated with a 14% higher Alzheimer's risk. I want to be precise here because the range across studies is wide and the honest version of this science is more nuanced than a single number. The most conservative meta-analysis, adjusting for all available sources of heterogeneity, found 29 to 34% higher dementia risk with social isolation. The highest estimates reach 62 to 72%. The specific number depends on how isolation is measured, how long people are followed, and how thoroughly reverse causation is controlled. But every study in this literature points the same direction, and the biological mechanisms are now understood. Social engagement builds cognitive reserve directly, through intellectual stimulation, through the cognitive demands of reading other people's emotional states, through the language processing that conversation requires. It also regulates the brain's inflammatory environment. Chronic isolation activates the same stress response pathways as physical threat, a sustained, low-grade neuroinflammatory state that creates exactly the conditions in which Alzheimer's pathology accelerates. The distinction I need to make here, because it matters. Social isolation and introversion are not the same thing. Introversion is a preference for quieter, smaller-scale social interaction. Isolation is weeks passing without meaningful conversation with another person. The research finding applies to isolation, to the brain being deprived of substantive human contact, regardless of whether the person subjectively identifies as lonely. I want to tell you about Kenneth. He is 73 years old, a retired civil engineer from Tennessee. He describes himself as a private person, has his whole life. After his wife passed 2 years ago, the weeks that went by without a real conversation with another person began to stretch. He was not suffering in any way he would have named. He read, he watched documentaries, he kept his mind busy. His daughter noticed at Thanksgiving that he kept losing words mid-sentence in a way that was new. His physician ordered cognitive testing. The results showed measurable decline from baseline. His neurologist made a specific recommendation, not medication, not a supplement, but structured and regular social engagement, the kind involving genuine intellectual exchange, not just proximity to other people. Kenneth joined a strategy gaming club at his local library. He began weekly phone calls with 2 former colleagues working through technical problems on a consulting project. 3 months later, repeat cognitive testing showed scores that had stabilized and in 2 domains improved. His neurologist told him, "The single change that correlates with this result is the social engagement. I have no other explanation. What matters is not the number of people. It is the regularity and the intellectual substance of the contact. A weekly conversation with one person whose thinking challenges yours does more for your cognitive reserve than 50 passive interactions. Start there. This is where the number in the title of this video comes from. And I want to give you the real version of it, not the simplified one, because you deserve to understand what the research actually found. In 2015, a team of researchers at Rush University Medical Center published results from a prospective cohort study following 923 adults across Chicago area retirement communities over an average of 4.5 years. They called their dietary pattern the MIND diet, a hybrid of the Mediterranean and DASH diets, specifically refined to emphasize the foods with the strongest individual evidence for brain health. The finding: adults in the highest tier of adherence to this diet had a 53% lower rate of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to those with the lowest adherence. Adults with moderate adherence, not strict, not highest, just meaningfully better than poor, had a 35% lower rate. There are two things about that finding that I need to be precise about, because the honest version is more useful than the inflated one. First, this is an observational cohort study, not a randomized controlled trial. It cannot prove that the diet caused the protection. The finding was adjusted for age, sex, education, genetic risk, physical activity, cognitive activities, and calorie intake, and it held. It was subsequently replicated in the Framingham Heart Study. A 2022 autopsy study from Rush University found that people who had maintained higher MIND and Mediterranean diet adherence for 10 or more years had measurably fewer amyloid plaques in their brain tissue at the time of death. The biological signal is consistent and has been replicated, but associated with is the scientifically accurate framing, not causes. Second, in 2023, the New England Journal of Medicine published the first large randomized controlled trial of the MIND diet specifically, involving 604 participants. It found no significant cognitive difference between the MIND diet group and a healthy controlled diet group over 3 years. The critical context: both groups improved. The control diet in that trial was also a reasonably healthy diet, not a typical Western diet. The 53% comparison was always against the lowest adherence group, the people eating the worst diets. What the 2023 trial suggests is not that the MIND diet fails. It is that moving from terrible eating to decent eating may produce most of the gain, which makes the habit more accessible, not less. Here is what the diet actually specifies, because eating healthy and MIND diet adherence are not the same category, and the difference is measurable. The research thresholds are green leafy vegetables at least 6 times per week, other vegetables at least once per day, berries at least twice per week, nuts at least 5 times per week, fish at least once per week, olive oil as your primary cooking fat, whole grains at least 3 times per day, beans every other day, poultry twice per week. And the foods to limit: red meat, butter and margarine, cheese, pastries and sweets, and fried or fast food. The mechanism behind why this specific pattern protects the brain is now understood in considerable detail. Alzheimer's is now recognized as fundamentally an inflammatory disease, driven by the chronic overactivation of the brain's immune cells called microglia. This sustained neuroinflammatory state accelerates both amyloid accumulation and the spread of tau pathology. The components of the MIND diet, particularly the anthocyanins in berries, the oleocanthal in olive oil, and the polyphenols in leafy greens, directly suppress the inflammatory signaling pathway that drives microglial overactivation. They do not simply nourish the brain, they reduce the pathological environment that the disease requires in order to progress. Emerging research from 2022 to 2024 is also identifying a gut-brain connection here. The MIND diet's high fiber and plant diversity substantially alter gut microbiome composition. Certain beneficial bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate and propionate, that can cross the blood-brain barrier and directly disrupt the formation of the neurotoxic amyloid oligomers that are among the earliest drivers of Alzheimer's pathology. This research is still preliminary, but it adds a second mechanism to a dietary pattern already supported by robust observational data. Here is the finding that ties all 6 habits in this video together. A study published in Neurology in 2020, funded by the National Institute on Aging, and drawing from combined Rush University cohorts of 2,765 adults, found that people who maintained 4 or 5 of the 5 healthy behaviors measured, which included diet quality, physical activity, cognitive engagement, not smoking, and moderate alcohol, had a 60% lower Alzheimer's risk compared to people who maintained none or 1. 2 or 3 of the behaviors, 37% lower risk. The habits are individually meaningful. Combined, the effect compounds. Habit 2 is the habit that makes the hippocampus physically larger. I want to say that plainly because the evidence for it is that direct. In 2011, a randomized controlled trial led by researchers at the University of Pittsburgh assigned 120 older adults to either an aerobic exercise program or a stretching control group for 1 year. The aerobic group walked briskly 3 times per week at elevated heart rate. At the end of the year, brain scans showed that the aerobic exercise group had increased hippocampal volume by approximately 2%. The control group's hippocampal volume decreased, as expected with normal aging. That 2% increase represents the reversal of roughly 1 to 2 years of age-related hippocampal shrinkage. Not a slowing of the shrinkage, a reversal. The mechanism has 2 components, and both are now well established. The first is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. This is a protein that supports the survival of existing neurons and promotes the growth of new ones. It is the brain's equivalent of growth fertilizer, and aerobic exercise is the most powerful non-pharmaceutical stimulus for its production that science has identified. BDNF promotes hippocampal neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the brain region that Alzheimer's damages first. It strengthens synaptic plasticity, the cellular mechanism of learning. It directly counteracts the synaptic dysfunction that amyloid beta causes. In Alzheimer's brains, BDNF levels are markedly lower than in age-matched healthy controls. The second component is irisin, a hormone released by skeletal muscle during aerobic effort. Irisin crosses the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the brain, it boosts BDNF production and has been shown in research published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience to suppress amyloid accumulation directly. The communication pathway from your contracting quadriceps to your hippocampus is a real, measurable biological signal. Every brisk walk, every swim, every cycling session is sending a message from your muscles to the part of your brain that Alzheimer's targets first, telling it to grow, to strengthen, and to resist. A systematic review and meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2022 found that regular physical activity is associated with a 35 to 45% lower dementia risk across large cohort studies. The US trial, a randomized controlled trial published in JAMA in 2025, enrolling over 2,100 sedentary older adults at elevated dementia risk, found that after 2 years of intensive lifestyle intervention, including aerobic exercise 4 times per week, participants tested cognitively like people 1 to 2 years younger than equally aged controls who did not participate. The threshold that consistently appears in the research is 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic activity. That means elevated heart rate, brisk walking, cycling, swimming, where you are breathing harder and conversation requires a little more effort, not light activity, not being on your feet all morning. The specific biological mechanisms, the BDNF production, the hippocampal growth, the irisin signal, are triggered by cardiovascular intensity, not by low-level daily movement. If you are not currently meeting 150 minutes per week, start with 20 minutes, 3 times a week. The dose-response relationship in this research is not all or nothing. Some is better than none. Consistent is better than occasional. And the direction is what matters first. Before I tell you what this habit is, I want to say something directly. There is a randomized controlled trial published in Nature Communications in January of this year, confirming, for the first time in human subjects, that what happens in your brain during sleep has a direct, measurable effect on the clearance of the exact proteins that form Alzheimer's plaques. It is peer-reviewed. It is the first human RCT of its kind. Your doctor has almost certainly not mentioned it. Not because it is obscure, because a 15-minute appointment was never designed to hold it. Habit 1 is sleep. Not sleep in the general sense of lying in bed for 7 hours. Sleep in the specific sense of what your brain is doing during the 90 minutes of deep, slow-wave sleep, called deep NREM, that your body requires each night to perform what is now understood to be its most critical maintenance function. Here is the mechanism. During deep NREM sleep, the neurons in your brain physically shrink. Their volume contracts by up to 60%. This is not pathological. It is the architecture of the brain's overnight cleaning system, called the glymphatic network. The space between brain cells expands dramatically as those neurons contract. Cerebrospinal fluid floods through that expanded space along channels that run beside the brain's blood vessels. It physically flushes amyloid beta and tau, the proteins that form Alzheimer's plaques and tangles, out of the brain tissue and into the lymphatic drainage system where they are removed from the body. This process runs almost exclusively during deep NREM sleep. The channels through which it operates are controlled by specialized water transport proteins called aquaporin 4 channels, which line the surfaces of the brain's supporting cells. These channels degrade with age. People carrying the APOE4 genetic variant, the variant most closely associated with Alzheimer's risk, show impaired aquaporin 4 function, meaning their glymphatic clearance is already compromised by genetics. Sleep quality is the one modifiable variable that meaningfully restores it. The Nature Communications trial published in January 2026, a randomized crossover study of 39 participants, directly measured glymphatic clearance during normal sleep versus sleep deprivation. It confirmed that sleep-active processes significantly enhance the clearance of amyloid beta and tau into the plasma. This is not an animal study. It is the first human confirmation that what happens in your brain while you sleep is a direct biological lever for Alzheimer's risk. It was peer-reviewed and published 4 months ago. A separate finding from prior research, published in PNAS and cited widely since, even a single night of sleep deprivation in young, healthy adults measurably increases amyloid beta burden in the brain, as detected by PET imaging. Not months of poor sleep, 1 night. For adults over 60, the margin is narrower than most people realize. Chronic short sleep, consistently below 7 hours, is associated with approximately 30% higher dementia risk across multiple large prospective cohort studies. And there is a complicating factor that affects an estimated 30% of people over 60 and is undiagnosed in the majority of those it affects: obstructive sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a condition in which breathing repeatedly pauses during sleep, fragmenting the deep NREM cycles that run the glymphatic system. A person with untreated sleep apnea may be spending 8 hours in bed and accumulating amyloid every single night, because the brain never reaches the depth of sleep required to clear it. The warning signs are loud snoring, waking in the morning feeling unrefreshed despite adequate time in bed, and daytime fatigue that does not resolve. If any of those describe you, asking your doctor about a sleep study is not a minor quality of life question. It is an Alzheimer's risk question. I want to tell you about Elaine. She is 69 years old, a former pharmacist from Ohio. For years, she had understood herself as someone who slept adequately, 7 to 8 hours most nights, never dramatic insomnia, nothing that alarmed her. What had been slowly accumulating was a pattern her son noticed during phone calls. She would ask the same question she had asked 10 minutes earlier. Not every call, often enough that he kept track. She had noticed it too, and explained it as fatigue, as stress, as being distracted. She mentioned it to her physician, who suggested she might benefit from a sleep study. The results showed severe obstructive sleep apnea. She was stopping breathing an average of 51 times per hour. Her glymphatic system had been fragmenting every night for years. She was sleeping by the clock, and her brain was never cleaning itself. She was fitted with a CPAP device and used it consistently. At her 6-month follow-up, her son told her the phone calls had changed. The questions that repeated themselves had become rare. Her internist, reviewing her vascular markers and metabolic panel, wrote in his notes, "Whatever this patient has changed in the last 6 months, her cardiovascular and inflammatory profile is the best I have documented in a patient of her age." The research is consistent, and the mechanism is now confirmed. Adults who consistently achieve 7 to 8.5 hours of quality sleep, with adequate deep NREM and no untreated apnea fragmenting it, are giving their brain its most powerful nightly defense against the accumulation that precedes Alzheimer's disease. 3 commitments. 1. A consistent bedtime and wake time, including weekends. The glymphatic system runs on a circadian rhythm. Inconsistency disrupts its timing regardless of total hours. 2. Protect the deep NREM window specifically. Alcohol in the evening, screens in the hour before bed, and ambient light all suppress slow-wave sleep. These are not comfort suggestions. They are the specific conditions your brain's cleaning cycle requires. 3. If you snore, if you wake up exhausted after a full night, ask your doctor about a sleep study. This conversation is not optional. A randomized controlled trial confirming the brain's nightly cleaning mechanism was published 4 months ago. The average medical appointment runs 15 minutes. Sleep rarely comes up. Now you understand why I made this video. 6 habits. I want to be honest with you about something before I send you anywhere with this. Knowing 6 things and implementing 6 things simultaneously are 2 different problems. Most people who find this information feel the urgency clearly and then attempt to change everything at once. Within 2 weeks, they have changed nothing. The momentum of daily life absorbs the effort before any habit stabilizes. What the evidence supports is a layered, sequential approach, 1 habit at a time, introduced every 2 weeks, with the pattern stable before the next begins. That architecture holds. Trying to hold all 6 simultaneously generally does not. For viewers who want a structured implementation, not general motivation, but a concrete week-by-week 90-day plan built directly on these 6 habits, I put together what I call the Brain Protection Blueprint. Weeks 1 and 2, the mind diet specifically, the exact servings, what to swap, a starter shopping list. Weeks 3 and 4, the exercise protocol, layered on top. Weeks 5 and 6, the sleep optimization protocol. And on through all 6, with a self-assessment at the start, so you know exactly where your current risk profile sits before you begin, and habit tracking sheets for each stage. If that would help you, the link is in the description. Now I want to leave you with a picture, not a goal, a picture. It is a Saturday morning, 6 months from now. You wake up before your alarm. The house is quiet. You slept 7.5 hours. You can feel the difference from the nights you did not. There is no effort to start your day. You make coffee and stand at the kitchen window in the early light, thinking about nothing in particular. Your grandchild is arriving later this morning. You are not calculating in advance how tired you might be, whether you will be sharp enough, whether you will find the words when you want them. You are simply there, in the morning, with your coffee. That is not a metaphor. That is a specific biological state, the result of 6 habits, consistently maintained, operating together as they were designed to. It is not guaranteed. No one can promise you that. But the research says this. It is available. The trajectory is yours to influence. None of what I told you today requires a prescription. None of it requires a referral, a specialist, or a drug that has not yet been approved. And yet, for reasons that have everything to do with how medicine is structured and nothing to do with whether the science is real, it is the conversation that almost never takes place. It took place today. You are not a passive patient waiting to see what your genes decide. You are the person who found out what your doctor did not have time to tell you, and then did something about it. That is who you are choosing to be today. Tell me in the comments, which of these 6 habits are you starting first? And if someone you care about needs to hear this, a parent, a sibling, a friend who just got a result that frightened them, share this video. It may be the most useful thing you do for them today. Subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. The house is still yours. Show up for it.